Hello, I'm Doug Musio. This is part 2 of a special Middle East edition of City Talk. Joining me again to talk about the Middle East is a distinguished Middle East hand, Richard Murphy, former U.S. ambassador to Mauritania, Syria, the Philippines, and Saudi Arabia. He served as Secretary of State for Near Eastern and Asian Affairs during the Reagan years. Ambassador Murphy is a widely consulted expert and frequent TV commentator on things Middle East. A pleasure.
Mine. Thank you.
Like all good soap operas, we'll take a minute to review what happened last week. Last week we talked about Rice's trip to the Middle East. We talked about the situation in Lebanon. We talked about Palestine. And we began our discussion of Iraq. Let's go back to Iraq and look what's happening right now. What's the situation on the ground right now? And what's the situation in terms of diplomacy, in terms of U.S. policy?
Situation on the ground is getting very ugly. That we'll call it sectarian warfare between the Sunni and the Shia seems to be steadily on the increase.
And the UN report last couple of weeks ago just shows that the number of casualties is increasing dramatically.
We continue to suffer casualties, but nothing like the percentage increase that is killing off the Iraqis themselves. And it's enough to have the name of a Shia or a Sunni to cause your death, as it was in Lebanon during the civil war in Lebanon. Now, we've been very resistant to the talk of a civil war. Is there a civil war or not? Forget it. Let's not play the games. There's sectarian war. Whether that's a civil war or not, let's leave it to history to decide, but it's a mess.
What do we do? And we're part of the mess. How do we unmake the mess? How do we make the mess less of a mess?
Well, you know, we moved in very confidently that we could bring about a rapid transformation of that society. And you take the politics, you know, just in very basic terms, there had been Sunni dominance, even though the Sunnis were a minority. Mm-hmm. The Arab Sunnis, I mean, leave the Kurds aside, who were Sunni, but politically the Iraqi Arab Sunni were fewer in number than the Shia. But over the centuries, they had dominated. Now, when we came in with the idea of elections, and free elections, and let's get everybody out there, and don't anybody be intimidated by threats of death if you go out to vote. We were very proud to see the rising percentage of people that went out to vote over these repeated elections, during these elections. But it didn't, it should not have distracted us from the reality that we were overturning a centuries-old, 1,400 years of dominance by one group of another.
So democracy simply meant Shia dominance.
And I, as a Sunni, am being asked to give up everything. And I don't say harmony in Iraq before, under Saddam, or before Saddam himself. There were more peaceable times and less brutal times in Iraqi history than Saddam's period. But it had been a period when the Sunnis felt they could run things. And there was a coexistence, there were marriages, there were intermarriages between Sunni and Shia, particularly in the main cities like Baghdad. And it wasn't always the first question, is he a Sunni or is he a Shia? Now, we didn't create this problem, but the abrupt removal of Saddam stirred the fire, shall we say, under the ashes that had long been there.
Did we play an even hand here? Did the initial government, the conditional provisional authority, play it even-handedly? And could they have played it differently?
I think we tried to. I think we tried to play it in the American sense, almost mathematically. Hey, if the Shia are, as is generally conceded, 60% of the population, they should have 60% of the seats in whatever parliament comes about.
But again, American ignorance and, in a sense, arrogance that we, first of all, understood, and if we didn't understand, we had the power to impose.
Well, we overestimated our power to inspire and or impose, and the resistance that was going to be stirred up.
Well, and then also the fact that we didn't produce stability immediately, the diluting, that lasted for months, clearly signaled failure almost at the beginning.
Chaos is worse than the worst dictatorship in the eyes of the fellow who's suffering under chaos.
What are the likely prospects here? I mean, are we talking about a tripartite split, which seems to be very difficult? Is that even possible? What happens? I mean, do you suck in this vacuum, the Turks, the Iranians? What are the various possibilities out there?
I don't think a split into three separate states is realistic or a goal that we should follow or that we should accept, because it leaves hanging the Sunni, who are 25–30% of the population, and in the main Sunni areas there is no oil. And in the main urban area of Baghdad, there's an enormous mixed population of Sunni and Shia. Mm-hmm. So the ethnic cleansing, quote unquote, that would follow would be a horrible bloodbath. It's already signs of what it might turn into.
Go ahead.
But what do we do? Why talk of sucking in the neighbors? We got to work with the neighbors. I don't think any one of those neighbors wants to see Iraq break into pieces, because they know that the other neighbor would then move and try to exploit the opportunities.
So how do they behave? How do the Turks behave? How do the Iranians behave? And how do we behave? And in a sense, go ahead. I can't ask too many questions at once.
No, they're all good, fair questions. For one thing, we're not in touch with two of the players in Iraq, the Iranians and the Syrians. It's all very well to say, as the administration has said about Syria, well, we've got an embassy there, and anyway, the important thing is they know what we want, and they know what they have to do. That doesn't work. You can't just sit back in a lordly fashion and say, do what you know you have to do. They both, in the case of Syria and Iran, one thing they definitely agree on is their regimes want to survive. And they've had ample reason to suspect that we don't want to see them survive.
I mean, Iran certainly is part of the axis of evil. I mean, we said that they are evil. You destroy evil, so it's not irrational on their part that they might think that we might be after them.
I never thought the Iranians were irrational. They're very, very nationalistic. They're very proud, and the worst thing that we could do in terms, if we really would like to see the system, the regime evolve, change shape and form, in Iran, the worst thing we can do is to unite them on the issue of nuclear, that you have no right to a nuclear program. Mm-hmm. It's a very tricky one, because I don't think any of us want to see nuclear weapons in the hands of a mad dog Iranian leader. And unfortunately, some of the things that have been said by the present president of Iran
might lead to that characterization.
Yeah. But the fact is, Iran knows, I believe, the limits of its power and its role, but it feels massively disrespected and underestimated and excluded, principally by us, from its natural role in the region. Now, I say there are limits to its natural role, because they are a Shiite power, and the history has a long story of tension and balancing acts and fights and wars between Shia and Sunni.
Is there, first of all, explain to me again and the audience the conflict between Shia and Sunni?
Well, you got better people right in the city who were experts on the Shia-Sunni split, but in my definition, very simple-minded.
I'll take it.
Okay, for the first generation or so of Islam, there was a debate and then a war over who should be considered in the ordained succession to the Prophet Muhammad. And for the group which became known as the Sunni, the Orthodox, it was by consensus initially among the circle of his disciples should be, the best man should be chosen, and future leaders, future caliphs should be chosen by consensus as the wisest rulers. The Shia emphasized the blood descent from the Prophet, from a member of his family. Well, the leading members of that family were killed in a war that took place in Iraq, actually, in Najaf and Karbala, in, I don't remember the exact year, but within the generation after the death of the Prophet, within 2 generations after the death of the Prophet. Now, the split started there, but hey, there's cultural differences, there are historical forces at work. There was a Persia before there were Arab countries. There was a Persia that Alexander the Great fought against, etc. So it's a complicated issue, and if you want to pursue it, you've got people like Bernie Heikel here at NYU, who's a real authority on this.
Now, I want to get back to Iraq, but I want to stay on this Shia item for a bit. It seems that there's a Shia ascendancy here. Hezbollah, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, which is a Sunni regime. Is there a Shia ascendancy, and what does that mean? And how much of it is Shia with Iran, and how much of it is nationalistic Persia?
Well, that's, for me, the easiest is your last question. How much is nationalism at work in Iran today, and how much is it that they are Shia? That they are Shia is to mean they understand, they accept, they embrace martyrdom, as their leaders were martyred by the Sunni back in the 7th century of our era. The 1st century of Islam, they have learned to live with martyrdom and to, I hate to say it, to enjoy, and to welcome it. It's just their fate. But when you look at leaders like the first spiritual leader in Iran after the Shah was deposed, the Ayatollah Khomeini, if you look at his statements, there's this recurrent theme of being Iran first. The great defender of Islam, and every other leader in sight around the Islamic world, was unworthy as far as the Ayatollah Khomeini was concerned. There were no one was as worthy as the Iranian leadership. But he emphasized the fact that he was Iranian.
Now, does that not mean that in terms of all diplomatic efforts and other efforts, this knowledge that nationalism is the preeminent force here, doesn't that structure the way we deal with Iran differently than this idea of the Islamofascists who are driven by this religious ideology, or doesn't it matter?
It matters a great deal the way we talk, and it's
and we know that words mean a lot.
Yeah. I mean, Islamofascist as a term doesn't mean much of anything to me. It
doesn't mean much to me.
Grasping
but it means
for some way to enlist public support in the United States because we're all against fascism. You remember what happened in the Second World War? We fought fascism, and we're fighting it still. Again, it doesn't make sense, and it doesn't help us come to terms with diversity in the Islamic world. We haven't found a term that is neutral. We've talked of Islamists, we've talked of political Islam, of radicals, of extremists. But the tricky thing is, if you attach Islamic to almost any phrase, it gives that force or that party some respect in the broader community. If it's Islamic, hey, it can't be all bad, because who's against Islam? The Crusaders.
Okay. You talked about diversity among Islamists. You personally have been involved in a number of efforts to create dialogue. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, I'm happy to. It's only one of several efforts to get a better understanding of what makes movements like the Muslim Brotherhood or Hamas or Hezbollah tick. This is a group that involves a small number of Americans, of Europeans, meeting with not officials of Hamas or Hezbollah or the Brotherhood. That's not our interest, but meeting with people close enough to them to be able to talk to us.
So they have the ears of the leadership?
They have we're told so, that they have the ears of the leadership. So what we say about how Westerners look at the region and how we formulate Western policy can begin to make some sense to them. Now, these are fellows...
And likewise.
And likewise. These are fellows who have never sat down and talked to Westerners. Most of us, and I'm talking a small group, this is maybe a total of a dozen on each side, and a mixed group of Europeans and 3-4 Americans on the western side.
And their backgrounds generally? I mean, your...
Backgrounds are from government, but not so. One from education, one from political life, and one from, a couple of us from diplomacy.
Nature of the conversations, what have you learned?
Every meeting starts with, so where are we now? We meet, say, 3 times a year. It's not a daily event, but so what's happened in the region, what's happened in Western policy, why? Personally, I think they must have gotten more out of it than I have. I'm not that much closer to a solid understanding of their thinking, except, and I think it's an important fact that I've gotten hold of, these fellows are not monolithic. They're not, even in the Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt, which was kind of the mother lode inspiring Islamists, political Islam, half-century ago.
And I guess the major opposition to the current regime.
The most effective political opposition, but they're under a lot of constraints in Egypt. They cannot compete in the elections as their party, as a Brotherhood party. They compete as independents, but I guess the Egyptian electorate knows who they are. But where they may have inspired Jordanian, Palestinian, Syrian movements over the years, what they have, and I heard this particularly from the Egyptians, what they've come to learn is that, they're not necessarily the only answer to the regime's policies of the Mubarak regime. They're not their affiliates are not the only answer to the leadership in Jordan or Syria or Palestine. They see themselves as critics of the regimes and ready to cooperate, ready to work with other critics. Now, what would they do if they got into power? That's a fair question. But they're more different among themselves than I had assumed before these talks started.
So if not pluralist in the sense that we think of the term here, there is plural thinking within what generally is seen as a monolithic.
Yeah, and what is generally seen, if I might say, is the Iranian model, where a leading cleric is in charge of everything and has all authority. They range over a whole wide range of political thinking, and what I've found is some of them are saying, look, politics and politicians have lost their moral bearings. They don't act on principle. We want to restore the principle. In our case, they're Islamic principles, but they are principles of responsibility, accountability, and they're not saying that just for the Western ears because they know that's music to our ears. They don't know that's our theme song.
Right.
But basically, we agree leaders should be accountable and responsible, and that moral principles, religious principles, have a part to play.
Okay, let's talk about Iraq. Let's go back to Iraq, and then we'll drift back and forth between Iraq and Iran. You said that the tripartite split's not going to work. federalism doesn't appear to be a model out there in the Middle East. Is that at all possible? And that seems to be the direction that at least the United States by policy is heading towards, sort of maybe an Articles of Confederation, a weak central government and stronger subnational units. But then you have the problem you had before, and that is, how do you structure these subnational units?
It's a great ideal, but it's still out of reach. Not to be patronizing, but it just isn't part of their history, of their culture, political culture.
So what's the answer?
Well,
or what are the possible outcomes rather than what's the answer?
Well, I think one thing is, I took issue, or at least challenge your use of the word, we're nervous about sucking in foreign neighbors, the neighbors. We got to bring in the neighbors. We can't keep the neighbors out. Each one's watching the other so that it doesn't get special advantage over themselves in the neighborhood. Since we haven't been talking to Iran, we haven't been talking in any serious way with Syria, we should get into that dialogue.
Diplomacy.
You're right. Come to think of it, that's diplomacy. Yeah, but
it's an option that we seem not to have exercised, despite race's recent globetrotting.
It's an ancient, long-standing, and dishonorable tendency in American politics to not talk to your enemies. You talk to your friends. You don't talk to your enemies. Well, some of these people aren't necessarily, some of these leaders aren't necessarily our enemies.
What do we say to them? Or what we say to them?
Well, we look for common ground. Do you, in Iran, want to see a situation of increasing instability in Iraq in your own backyard? You're always telling us, you Americans have no business in this area, it's our backyard. Well, do you want a mess in Iraq that will rocket out of control? They don't. They want to see a measure of stability where they have influence, sure.
But not control. They don't want necessarily want an Islamic Republic of Iraq.
They know they can't get it in Iraq.
Right, because of the numbers.
The numbers and the divisions in the Iraqi Shiite community. They're not all beholden.
And they don't want to be occupiers in any military sense, certainly. The Iranians.
No, I don't think so. I don't think there's any evidence.
What about
of that.
the Syrians? What about the Turks, for example?
The Turks' main concern is the independence of Kurdistan in the north. Mm-hmm. And that's been a nightmare for them as they've dealt at times very roughly with their own Kurds in eastern Turkey. It's a substantial amount of Turkish territory where the Kurds are dominant in the east. And they're afraid that of a magnet being created by an independent state of Kurds, which, you remember, I think it was President Wilson first said for an American leader that there should be an independent Kurdistan back at the Versailles negotiations.
Wow.
Well, and they were asking, when are we going to honor what President Wilson asked for? Well, we don't honor Kurdish independence, but rights and autonomy, and call it federalism down the road may be the solution, but to bring that about is going to take a much more cooperation between all of the neighbors than exists today, and between all of the neighbors ourselves and the Europeans, all of those that have an interest in a more stable Middle East.
What does a more stable Middle East look like?
Well, one where the Palestinians have their state and become a good neighbor to Israel, where Israeli existence in the area is accepted, as the Arab chiefs of state said they would accept Israel 4 years back in Beirut if it went back to the 67 lines and worked out a fair solution on the Palestinian refugees. It means where one of these days we have a regional-wide agreement on no nuclear arms, a denuclearization of the area, and guarantees, security guarantees to those whom we insist give up those arms or don't develop those arms. It means a whole range of developments which is going to take a regional-wide approach where, yes, we have special alliances and special friends there, as with Israel, as with the Saudis and the Egyptians, for darn good reasons. But where we approach the region as a whole and don't be seen as totally 100% identified with any one of those powers.
Which is the case now.
Which is the case.
Prospects over the next year. What is a good case, if not a best case scenario, and what is your considered judgment about where we're going to be in reality?
I hope that a year from now we will see some bilateral talks launched between Washington, Damascus, and Tehran. Washington, Tehran, Washington, Damascus. I hope that we will see talks which are designed, first of all, to put to rest their convictions, or change their convictions that we're out to destroy those regimes, root and branch, to tear them up. Mm-hmm. Because I don't think we are. I don't think that's the reality, but that's still the perception in their minds. I hope we can see in Israel a readiness to find that negotiating partner that Sharon and others have said doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. I think he did exist a year ago in Mahmoud Abbas, the president, but they weren't ready to do enough. We didn't do enough to support him, and his party lost in those elections, which are haunting us today. That we do support the moderates versus the radicals, but that we don't slip into rhetoric which implies that, yeah, we are enemies of Islam, that we clean up our act as these various players adjust their sights to what's achievable for the goal they all really do want, which is a peaceful solution.
15 seconds. I know it's not enough time. What could the United States or what should it be doing right now?
It should be opening talks with Tehran, above all. The nuclear issue, the alleged interest in destroying Israel. I think we need to get to terms with that to see just, is that really serious, or is that good old Iranian rhetoric? Okay.
You're going to come back, but we're not going to wait a year.
No, because I don't want a year to discredit me.
Oh, no. Well, that's why I didn't ask you for any predictions. Thank you very much.